Okay, for the record, I'm Jason Sartori. I'm the Chief of the Functional Planning and Policy Division at the Planning Department, and we're here this morning to talk about the update, the 2020 update to the Subdivision Staging Policy. I wanted to just take a real quick second to introduce and let you know that we have our outstanding team of dedicated planners on this project. Some of them are here with me this morning, including Lisa Gavoni, Jesus Beck, and Sarah Bond from our Functional Planning and Policy Division, as well as Corinne Blackford from Research and Special Projects. And they may chime in at times in the very likely chance that I say something incorrect. They'll make the correction for me. So I wanted to acknowledge their being on this call today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So today, I just wanted to take a second to explain the purpose of today's briefings. You have two briefings today on the subdivision staging policy. And the purpose is to provide an overview of planning staff's recommendations that are contained within that the working draft of what we're now calling the County Growth Policy, the 2020 County Growth Policy, also known as the Subdivision Staging Policy. And we'll talk a little bit about that recommended name change. The first item, item 3, we're going to talk about that name change. It covers our recommendations related to the name change, as well as the school element recommendations and the tax-related recommendations. And then item 4, which will come next, will be dedicated to the transportation element recommendations. And that'll be led by Eric Gray, one of our transportation supervisors and consultants that we've had help with that. We'll also ask you to have a motion to approve the working draft as the public hearing draft, to officially set the date of the public hearing, and also to transmit what the county code requires as the quote-unquote the staff draft of the subdivision staging policy to the county council. Now, that is not the official planning board draft that has to be sent by August 1st. This is an interim draft that is required to be sent to the county council by June 15th.
Jerry Sushi, you show that one sketch, that school, the barn, is in the city of Rockville, and in your presentation somewhere, could you touch on locating stuff in Rockville and Gaithersburg to meet school needs of the county?
Sure. Well, I have to tell you that picture, that is an actual photograph. It looks like a sketch. It looks, I actually took that on Memorial Day, on Monday. That is a real photo of a real school, the newest elementary school that we have in the county. It's in Rockville, as you mentioned, the Richard Montgomery cluster. But yeah, it's yeah.
My wife's been doing substitute teaching there, but closed at the moment. So.
Right. Well, yes. Well, and it was, there weren't many people in any of the photos that I went around taking on Monday. So, okay. So just to give you a sense of
when you cite something. That decision, whether it winds up in the county or in the city or Gaithersburg or Rockville, is there any difference in making a decision on those?
Sure. Well, and I will say that, so today we're not going to get into much of the detail in terms of we can talk about specific recommendations and their impacts in different areas and parts of the county. However, what I did want to emphasize today is really an opportunity for us to highlight those recommendations that we have, and to kind of set the stage for the upcoming meetings. And so we do have, we hope to schedule the public hearing for June 11th, and that will be followed by 5. Right now we've got 5 work sessions that we have scheduled to work with the planning board to really get into the deliberation and debating and discussion and potentially alternatives to the recommendations that we have. And so this is I'm going to try to refrain from leading us in a direction where we, have debate or deliberation on a specific recommendation, and really try to hold that off for the planning board work sessions after you've had the public testimony. And then the meeting that you have on July 30th is when we hope to completely wrap this up and transmit the official planning board draft to the county council. So I also wanted to talk for a second about the effort that went into developing these policy recommendations. First and foremost, the effort placed a huge emphasis on developing recommendations that are data-driven, and stakeholder-informed. And you've seen a lot of the data that we've prepared for this effort in previous presentations and previous briefings. But we also went out to the community and shared the data with different stakeholder groups, with people from different parts of the county. We shared the data in more intimate roundtable discussions and then in presentations to large community organizations. We wanted to get numerous people's impressions and understandings of the policy and the factors that are involved with it. And so we asked probing questions. We challenged people to consider other points of view and to defend their arguments with supporting data. We didn't just want to hear all of the different perspectives. We really wanted to understand them. And so it's with that understanding, both of the different perspectives and of the data, that it really led us to where we are today. And it's what brought us to the recommendations that are contained in the working draft. Are the recommendations perfect? Well, we'll see. I guess that's what we have the work sessions for. But I'm confident that everyone out there can find something in here that they'll love, and everyone can probably find something that they don't. In the end, we tried to strike a balance, understanding the different perspectives and concerns that are brought to this policy. And, but most importantly, we really strive to develop good policy, and we think we have in what we are recommending. Nevertheless, we do look forward to our work sessions with the Planning Board as we dive into each of the recommendations. There were certain overarching themes that we discovered as we worked on this effort over the last 10 months or so, and so I just wanted to highlight those for a brief second. First was that a one-size-fits-all policy does not work in a county with such diverse growth contexts. We need a policy that can be adaptable to the different growth contexts and desired growth patterns that we have in the county, and that can be flexible enough to change with time. Then we wanted to shift the focus of the policy, and you've heard me say this before, but from limiting growth in areas with inadequate school infrastructure to one, because really it's proven that that's had a limited effectiveness in, I'd say, even equitably addressing school capacity issues, to creating a policy that it helps ensure the adequacy of school infrastructure to help achieve the desired patterns and types of growth that we want. And then finally, we wanted to create a policy that helps support the county's other policy priorities. With that, the major recommendations that I'll be covering today include, the renaming to the county of the policy to the county growth policy, and I'll just touch on that briefly even right now. We felt that this was more indicative of what this policy is about and what it should strive to be. That it's not just about the adequacy of infrastructure, but it's about being able to target how and where we grow using the tools that we have in place in this policy. And as we have a changing growth context countywide, this seemed more appropriate. And it's really even a retro name, because the policy used to be called the annual growth policy, and now we're recommending it be called the county growth policy. Then we also have, we're recommending major reductions in the use of moratoria, essentially eliminating what we refer to as automatic moratoria in 93% of the county. And then where we don't have that automatic moratoria, we establish standards for identifying areas that are subject to more detailed planning board review of school infrastructure adequacy, as well as establishing standards for requiring developers to pay what we're referring to as utilization premium payments. And then finally, we also have recommendations related to changes to the impact tax structure that make it more context sensitive and helps it promote other policy priorities. And what is not mentioned here is part of that is we also have some recommendations to the recordation tax that we could talk about. So here is basically what's in the purview of this item on your agenda. We're talking about Chapter 3 of our working draft. That's our policy, the name change. Chapter 4 is the schools element, and then Chapter 6 includes all of our tax recommendations. The Chapter 5 is the transportation element, and that's what will be talked about in the next item on your agenda. Now, I am not going to go into detail on every single one of these unless you ask. So my plan is just give you a quick highlight now of what's included in here. And then there are one or two that I do want to spend a little bit of time going into the details of because they kind of underpin a lot of the other recommendations. Then I'll come back to this screen, and if there's any particular one that you would like to talk about, we can dive into that, and I can show you some of the data or some of the comments that we have related to that. So the one that I specifically, well, actually, let me just do a quick overview of this. So I mentioned already Chapter 3. Chapter 4, the schools element, is split up into 6 different sections. The first one, which is the one I'm going to spend some detailed time talking about, is the creation of school impact areas. And this is our effort to make the policy more context sensitive, and that really does underpin a lot of the other recommendations that we have all the way through. The second section deals with the annual school test, how it's conducted, what level it's conducted at, how long the test results last, and then also the addition of what we're referring to as the utilization report. And this is where we will be providing a one-stop shop for detailed, updated annually countywide utilization, school utilization data, as well as individual school utilization trends and facility conditions. Where with those, I will tell you, we're not recreating the wheel. A lot of it's data that already exists. It's primarily data that MCPS puts out. In some ways, we're looking at it differently than they've presented the data, but it's in multiple places. We're trying to pull it all into one location where it makes it useful to not just the community, but also to us as planners as we are, reviewing development applications or preparing master plans. And then the third section in Chapter 4 deals with the residential development moratorium. And I'll talk a little bit about this for sure today. And it's not just the applicability of the moratorium, but also the exceptions that we have to it. Then the next section deals with student generation rates and how they're calculated. The fifth section deals with development application review. And we have some recommendations in there related to your role in that in areas where there are moratorium is not applicable, and then also dealing with some changes to adequate public facilities extension requests and the extensions of the validity periods. And then finally in there we also have, in the interest of trying to improve collaboration, and I have to say throughout this process, MCPS has been very, helpful, and we've met numerous times. They've participated in our advisory team discussions, but they've also, I've had numerous meetings with folks there, and we just want to continue to strengthen the relationship between our two agencies and get them more involved in the development review process so that they might be able to identify opportunities for collaboration even with the developers, while at the same time they become more informed of the development pipeline, and we have the opportunity to be more informed of some of the things that they're planning or they might see as long-term options for different areas that are important to us. And then finally, this section deals with the utilization premium payments and the creation of those and how they are they're set. Chapter 6 deals with our tax recommendations, primarily school impact taxes and how they're calculated, and then the exemptions to those. And then finally, the recordation tax and some of the modifications, I would say pretty progressive modifications that we're recommending to the recordation tax. So again, I'll come back to this screen and see if there are particular ones that you want to go to, but now I'm going to jump into the discussing the school impact areas. So our recommendation here was to attempt to, again, try to create the policy, make a more context-sensitive policy. And so we wanted to classify different neighborhoods into what we're calling school impact areas based on their recent and anticipated growth contexts. And that this is something that won't be set in stone. It's something that would be updated every 4 years as the county growth policy is reviewed and updated. And so we looked at this and said, let's classify neighborhoods by 3 things. One, the amount of new housing that they're seeing, and not just historically, but also what's in the pipeline. Okay. Second was the type of new housing. Is that new housing coming in the form of single family or is it multifamily? And then the third was the amount of enrollment growth that area is experiencing. And we found some really interesting connections between all 3 of these. And, you know, we wanted to be able to group areas based on similar aspects of those characters of those 3 things. Ultimately, in the end, we identified 35 different planning areas that correspond to aggregations of individual census tracts. And we went with census tracts because we're able to tie a lot of important data to the census tracts as compared to school zones. They could have gone with elementary school areas. And the other thing with elementary schools or just school boundaries in general is that they do change. And in the census tracts will change, and we'll have a new set of census tracts after the 2020 census. However, they are still able to be aggregated in the same way. So we can have some consistency with how we work with these. We initially started with the planning areas that we used for other housing policies, including the housing needs assessment. And then ultimately we tried to look at each of the different planning areas to see what was driving how they were, how they were coming out in our kind of the model we had created, and we ended up pulling out a lot of our urban areas: the downtown Bethesda, downtown Silver Spring, the Wheaton CBD, Friendship Heights, White Flint, and then other census tracts that we found that were behaving differently than the others around them. Ultimately, our classifications came up with 3 different groups. And those have implications on how the school's element of the policy gets implemented and applied. So those 3 areas include the infill impact area. These are areas where we are seeing a high amount of housing growth, but it's predominantly multifamily, which is generating very few students on a per unit basis. That's not to say these areas are not experiencing enrollment growth. It's just on a per unit basis. It's not a lot of students, and so that is what distinguishes these particular areas. Our turnover impact areas, this is the vast majority of the county. Actually, it's nearly 90% of the county. These are areas with low housing growth, not much new development. That's not to say there isn't any at all. I mean, some neighborhoods could be kind of on the cusp of one of these, of 2 different areas here, but generally, very low housing growth, and any enrollment growth that we're seeing come out of this, the turnover impact areas is largely due to turnover of existing single-family neighborhoods. Now, again, that doesn't mean that every one of these areas is actually experiencing that high housing growth. Some of these neighborhoods might be in the low end of that cycle. They might not be turning over right now, very low enrollment growth, but they're neighborhoods where when the enrollment growth starts coming in, it will be due to turnover.
When you say turnover, you're saying the age of the household, or ages, or how are you defining turnover?
It's the sale of a home, essentially, as the occupant of the home changes. Oftentimes these single-family homes are sold by, just generalizing here, but sold by empty nesters, people without children, to a family with school-age children. And so when we see, growth in enrollment in a particular neighborhood, it's due not because there's new homes that people are moving into, but because the existing homes are being sold. So that's the turnover, is the turnover of the occupants of the home.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then our last area was is the Greenfield impact areas. And these are areas where we are experiencing high enrollment growth that is due largely to a high amount of housing growth that is predominantly single family. And these are the areas that are still, if you will, are kind of consistent with what led to this policy in the first place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll show you some of the data behind it. Here, this is a map of the school impact areas, and I just want to highlight We know that it probably would have been intuitive to use green for the Greenfield area, but we wanted to try to not confuse our school impact areas with the transportation policy areas. And so since they were already using green, we went with purple, or you could say grape for Greenfield. So, and then we've got the tan is our turnover area, and then the dark blue is our infill area. So this map will be here, and I'm going to show you some other data related to each of these as we go forward. First, in terms of land area, I mentioned earlier that the vast majority, almost 90% of the county, well, you can see it in the map, obviously, is in this tan, the turnover area. Down here, as I go through each of these, you'll see how the county is split between the three with respect to whatever it is I'm showing you. And then down here, you'll actually see the numerical amounts. So in this case, you can see over 288,000 acres are identified as turnover. This is now the population share in 2018, and you can see that we have a larger share of the population than the land area in our infill area. So 13.5% compared to when we go back to the land area, it was only 3.8%. And the same thing, well, kind of the opposite in the Greenfield area, where it's 7.2% of the county's land area. It's only 2.7% of the county's population. So it suggests that this is an area that's not very dense, whereas the infill areas are areas that are much more dense. When we look at population growth in the county, over 30% of the population growth over this 5-year period from 2013 to 2018 occurred within these identified infill areas. And almost 15.5% or so of the population growth occurred in that Greenfield area. When we look at housing units in 2018, this is very similar to what we saw on the population side. The infill area is outpacing its land area in terms of housing units, and the Greenfield area is short of its land area in terms of percentage. And that again suggests that this is not very dense and that the infill areas are much more dense. This is an interesting one, though. If you take a look at the housing growth between 2013 and 2018, 3/5 of the growth, 61% of the new housing units that were built over that 5-year period came in those infill areas. And again, when I say that there is some growth happening in the turnover areas, it's really not what's the predominant character of those neighborhoods. You can see the housing growth there was just about 28% over a 5-year period, and that's over the entire, 90% of the county that falls into that. The key thing, though, about this growth is to understand the types of units that are being built. And so what you see here, this shows you, again, down here, you can see the total number of units. In the infill area over that 5-year period, nearly 16,000 units were built, but 93% of them were multifamily units. Even in the turnover area, where we've seen over 7,000 new units built, more than half of them over that 5-year period were multifamily. The Greenfield area stands out in contrast, where it's got it grew by 2,800, almost 2,900 additional units. 95.5% of those were single family. Only 4.5% were multifamily over that 5-year period. So then we looked at enrollment. And again, these are not school boundaries. These are our own planning area boundaries that we've identified. And so, but because we have the enrollment data, we're able to see exactly how many students live in each of these areas. And in 2018, just under 10% of our county's public school students lived in the infill areas, and 4.2% in the Greenfield area. But you can see, obviously, the vast majority of students live in the turnover areas, 136,000. When we look at enrollment growth, this is where I think it starts to get really interesting. Here, just to point out, it's almost the same. They're both about a fifth, about a 1/5, a little more than a fifth of the enrollment growth, or increase in enrollment comes out of that Greenfield area, and just under 1/5, just under 20%, comes out of the infill areas. But I want to just kind of emphasize here how this relates to the other ones that I've shown you. So here, again, it's just about 21% and 19%. When we go back to the growth in population, you can see the population in the infill area was growing faster than the growth in enrollment in that infill area. So enrollment increased about 20%, but population increased almost 31%. And so the population is growing, but it's mostly growing with people who are not students. In contrast, in the Greenfield areas, population growth was just about 15.5%, but the enrollment growth was 21%. And so there, it's kind of suggestive that what we're seeing are more families moving to those areas, to that Greenfield area. And when we look at the housing piece of this, compare, again, this enrollment growth of 21%, 19%, to the housing growth that we saw. I mean, 61% of the new housing units are in our infill areas, but only 19% of the student growth. In contrast, that Greenfield area is 11% of the housing growth, but 21% of the student growth. So the type of housing that we're seeing here in that Greenfield area is really generating a lot of students. And you can see it in this next set of graphs that I have here. This shows you, relative to where it was in 2013, how much by 2015, what was the growth rate in population for each of the three different areas. And so, yes, there was population growth in all three areas. The county grew over the 5-year period in population of just over 5%, but the population growth in that Greenfield area was nearly 38%. Housing unit growth, pretty similar. The housing unit growth was higher in the infill area than the population growth was, but the same thing in the Greenfield area at 40%. But this is the one that's most striking, is the enrollment growth over a 5-year period from 2013 to 2018. The areas that we've identified as Greenfield areas grew by more than 50% in student enrollment. And that is a lot of enrollment growth in a 5-year period, and it's really difficult to keep up with that. Now, I'll show you one last thing on this, and that is the student generation rates. So these are, again, student generation rates are the average number of students per unit. And in this particular case, what you're looking at are kindergarten through 12th grade students. We didn't break it out by grade level. And it's all housing types. So we didn't break this out by multifamily, single family. This is all housing types. And you could just see, again, that the large number of units, but the very few relatively few students in the infill area causes a really low generation rate there. Essentially, this means it takes 5 units in the infill area to generate a single kindergarten through 12th grade student. In the turnover area, it's about twice the rate of the infill area, and the Greenfield area is more than 3 times the rate of the infill area. Countywide, we're looking at just over 0.4 students per unit. But how does this compare to where we were in 2013, again, in these identified areas? You can see the student generation rate has fallen in the infill area as a result of the new development that's occurred there, and that the fact that the student enrollment is not keeping pace. Turnover areas, student generation increased slightly, and the Greenfield area increased quite a bit, from 614 to 661. So that is the school impact areas, and I guess I would say I would take questions, but I did want to talk about the moratorium first, and then we can come back to answer any questions you have about either one of those. And then again, I'm happy to go into detail about any of the other recommendations that we have. So if we talk about the residential development moratorium, because I think this is another major feature of what we've recommended. So first, and actually I'm just going to focus really on this particular recommendation, 4.8, where we recommend not applying the automatic moratorium to the turnover and infill impact areas, but instead to only apply it in the Greenfield impact areas. And as you know, a moratorium means that you cannot, as the planning board, cannot approve a preliminary plan of subdivision for a residential use in an area that's under a moratorium unless it meets certain identified exceptions. So just to talk briefly about why we think this is important. And not that I necessarily feel that I think that there's more support behind this than we originally thought going in, but I think it's worth kind of explaining. The concerns with the current moratorium policy, first, is that it slows the county's ability to fill its housing gap. The county needs an additional 10,000 units, and that's on top of what we were already expecting by 2030 in order to meet our housing demand from population and job growth. And by stopping development in the county's infill areas in particular, the current moratorium policy makes it difficult for the county to fill that housing gap and to meet its share of the region-wide housing targets. And multifamily units in particular, multifamily development, as we saw with the housing needs assessment, the majority of our demand for new housing between 2020 and 2024 is in multifamily units. The current moratorium policy also just generally impacts housing affordability. By restricting the supply of housing in the face of increasing demand for it, the moratoria apply an upward pressure on housing prices and threaten the preservation of the county's affordable housing stock. The moratoria also stifle the county's moderately priced dwelling unit, MPDU, program. By stopping new residential development, we are preventing projects that would have provided new affordable units. The moratorium policy also hinders economic development. The county's residential development helps strengthen the economy by investing in the future of our communities, creating local jobs, increasing the tax base. Additionally, the infill projects in particular add public amenities, shopping, restaurants, and gathering spaces that attract new residents to vibrant, complete communities within the county's urban areas. The moratorium policy also prevents sustainable growth patterns. By halting development in desired growth areas, the moratoria encourage growth elsewhere and prevent sustainable growth patterns. It also raises some equity concerns. Oftentimes there's pressure from developers and community members, along with a desire to strengthen the county's economy, that leads the county council to fund school capacity projects in areas that not only are at risk of moratorium or in moratorium, but in areas where developers are looking to build. So under a constrained capital budget, as we are obviously now, but we seem to be always, those decisions frequently and sometimes repeatedly delay projects at other overcrowded schools simply because they are not in areas where developers are looking to build. And oftentimes those schools, not only are they overcrowded, they might have substandard facilities, and they're located, again, in areas with a lack of development interest. And so those overlooked schools can often have less engaged parent communities, parent advocates, and so they don't have the people fighting for them necessarily, and a disproportionate share of high-need students. And so we believe that we don't have to pit the best economic development decisions against the best educational decisions that MCPS would like to make, that we can actually afford and allow both. And then lastly, the current moratorium policy does not solve overcrowding. Stopping the development does not actually solve the overcrowding in the schools. And our research has also shown that the vast majority of countywide enrollment growth is coming from turnover of existing single-family neighborhoods, not new development. The one exception to that is in those Greenfield impact areas, right? Where, again, I'm not going to go back to the screen, but you remember, I mean, you could see the distinction in the Greenfield impact area from the others, that we're experiencing high population growth, high housing unit growth, and high student enrollment growth, and they're all connected. You know, those Greenfield impact areas are experiencing that, again, that type of development that originally led to the creation of the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance in 1973. And construction of new schools cannot keep pace with the rapidly increasing enrollment. And I'm going to highlight a graph that we actually had in one of our appendices, that we were looking at this yesterday, and we realized that this is kind of the school's version of induced demand. I know we talk about how increasing capacity of our roadways induces demand on for vehicles, vehicle travel. This is almost the same with relation to schools. So this shows you the Clarksburg cluster elementary schools from 2008 through 2018, and the enrollment growth that they experience is in the light blue, year by year. And what you can see in the dark blue, this is when new capacity came on, a major capacity. The first in 2009, this was when William B. Gibbs Jr. Elementary School opened. And then in 2011, there was a 10 classroom addition at Fox Chapel Elementary School. And then in 2014, Wilson Wims Elementary School opened. So in a 5-year period here, you had 3 major projects come on. This red line shows you the cluster-wide utilization. And you can see it was up near almost 120%, and then Gibbs Elementary School opened, and it came down. But then immediately after, it started jumping back up. And then the addition at Fox Chapel opened, and the utilization rate count cluster-wide came down, but then immediately started creeping back up to almost 120%, and that was only saved then by the opening of Wilson Wims Elementary School in 2014. And now, since then, it's crept back up, and here we are again, upwards of 120%. And what's not shown on here is in 2019, Snowden Farm, just this past fall, this was the first school year, Snowden Farm Elementary School opened up. That was the 8th elementary school in this cluster. Where's number 9? Number 9 just got delayed a year by the county council, but it's scheduled to open in 2023. So again, you know, this is just kind of emblematic of this area that we need to almost, to a certain extent, give MCPS an opportunity to really catch up with the growth that's occurring in this area. So that's the, and I'm going to go back to our index of recommendations. I can answer any questions you have about the 2 that I really highlighted, and then if you have a desire to go into detail on any of these other ones, I'm happy to do that. So let me know if you've got any questions.
Okay. Does that conclude your presentation, Jason?
Well, yes, and again, it can be a little interactive. If someone wants to go see some of the school impact tax stuff, I can pull that up. You know, any of the recommendations that we have here that you might be more intrigued by. But I think if we're just in the interest of time, it'll be really difficult to be able to go into detail on all of them. Again, when we get into the work sessions, we will go into very much detail about all of these, so each one individually.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was going to just ask board members to have any questions, but before I did that, I want to just clarify, at what point do we need to make this a public hearing draft, or what's the process for that?
Sure. So I'm going to ask after the transportation presentation in the next item, then I'm going to come back in with a request that you guys approve this working draft with. We've got a number of errata that we've already identified. You know, some figure numbers are completely off. Don't know what happened with those, but we'll get that fixed. That we're going to ask you to approve this as the public hearing draft, and then we will repost it with those corrections as the public hearing draft either today or tomorrow, and then set the public hearing for June 11th. And then the last part of that is the county code requires that by June 15th you and it specifically says the planning board must submit a staff draft of the subdivision staging policy to county council. So we'll just ask that you also transmit that public hearing draft as that official staff draft that's required to be sent by June 15th.
Okay, so we'll do that together with item 4.
All together.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Questions from the board?
Jerry, so I have a question. Just the WMAL site, the type of housing there, and is that going to be with a lot of children, or is it not? Just as an example. And then the other thing, too, is there's a requirement that they dedicate right-of-way for the school. What does that do in terms of development payments, dedicating land versus making payments towards the school?
So I would say that, what I'm aware of what's going at WMAL is that it is single family and townhouses primarily. Now, that's in here. If you can see where I'm showing you on the map, it's inside the triangle of the Beltway and the I-270 spur and I-270, and it's so we have that identified as still as a turnover impact area. It just didn't specifically trigger into an infill area, but it's, again, that's kind of an example that there are still pockets of neighborhoods in here that will kind of react a little differently. But that is probably more likely to generate students than multifamily development would. And then in terms of your second question was
dedicating the land for the school,
right? Yes.
Versus making payments for schools.
Right.
How does that fit in? Do you get a break on one or the other?
Yeah. So I will show you here. Right now, with school impact taxes, a developer does get a credit for land dedication or any improvements that they make that actually add classroom capacity. So if a developer was to build a school, and we don't really get that because no one is building a large enough site to, basically require an entire new school just by itself, right? So a lot of times when we get land dedication, there is a credit on their school impact tax. And one of the recommendations we have is to kind of expand that credit to other improvements. So I'm kind of expanding on your question here, but to allow a credit for other improvements to facility conditions that a developer might be able to fund or make. And so this is part of having MCPS more involved with the development review process, to find opportunities and for us to report the data that show a particular school might need a new roof or might need an HVAC replacement, but that might not be something that's funded right now. Well, a developer who's building in an area that's served by that school may choose to, to show support for the community, to make an offer to pay for that. And MCPS would be there to be able to accept that and then set a value to that, and that would provide them also a credit on the school impact tax.
All right. And my earlier question was, if you put it that Barnett way, it's in the city of Rockville, is there any difference between that, having a need in the city of Rockville, Gaithersburg, versus on county property or land outside those jurisdictions?
Right. So the location of the school specifically isn't as important as the area that it serves, right? And we do have some schools that are only within those cities and some that go across the city boundary and the and county land as well. And so we try to collaborate with the municipal our partners in the municipalities. They have their own separate, in both Gaithersburg and Rockville, they have their own separate adequate public facilities standards or ordinance. And oftentimes it mimics what we have, but when it doesn't, that sometimes causes a little bit of confusion or difficulty for a developer that might be building in an area that is served by a school that is, might be in Moratorium in Rockville, but we might not have it in Moratorium.
Are you sharing with them, the two cities, then what you're doing, and some consensus could be developed?
Yeah, so we had folks from their planning staff involved in all of our advisory team meetings, our schools technical advisory team. So they were active participants in that, and we've continued to maintain communication with them. In fact, they participated in interviews with the Urban Land Institute when ULI came in to review the recommendations that we have.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if I could just highlight on that, you know, there's some information in one of our appendices about that ULI advisory panel, but I don't have anything in here specific to that. But they did, at the end of April, came in and they reviewed where we were with our recommendations at that point, and they made several recommendations to us in large support of a lot of the things that we were recommending, but and some of the other changes that they recommended, we used to, we kind of tweaked our recommendations as a result. And so that was a really helpful effort to get people with some outside perspective taking a look at what we were recommending. So I'll go back to the index here. So if there were questions about any of the other recommendations that we have.
Any other questions?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.